Beneath the polished uniforms, behind the heavy oak doors of colonial mansions, and hidden under the strict codes of empire, Australia's earliest governors lived a life the public never truly saw. They preached order, discipline, and virtue, but when night fell, or when no one was watching, their desires told another story. What happens when men sent to govern a new colony, isolated, powerful, and unchecked, decide that their passions should be kept hidden? Tonight, we uncover how Australian governors masked their lustful desires. It is easy to imagine the governors of early colonial Australia as stern men of iron will, figures who embodied the authority of the British Crown. They arrived in a harsh and unfamiliar land, tasked with enforcing law among convicts, soldiers, and settlers. History books often describe them in terms of politics, governance, and exploration. But what about the lives they led behind the grand facades of their official residences? What about the emotions, the temptations, and the secret indulgences? The story of the governors of New South Wales and beyond is not just about building a colony. It is about men who found themselves far from home, far from their wives in many cases, and surrounded by possibilities that blurred the line between duty and desire. Picture Sydney in the late 18th century. The colony was still raw, a place where European settlers struggled to impose order on a rugged landscape. Convict laborers worked under the whip of overseers. Soldiers patrolled streets that were little more than dirt tracks. The air smelled of smoke from cooking fires and sweat from overcrowded barracks. And at the very top of this new society sat the governor. His residence, though simple compared to the grand estates of England, was still imposing compared to the hovels of the settlers. Candlelight flickered against the walls of his chambers. Servants moved silently through the corridors. And while by day he was a symbol of order, by night his desires whispered. Governors carried immense power. They controlled food rations, decided punishments, and even had the authority of life and death in some cases. This power extended beyond politics. It created opportunities to pursue hidden passions. When a man is given near absolute authority in a world with little oversight, the temptations multiply. In official portraits, governors stood rigid, medals gleaming, expressions stern. Yet the same men were rumored to hold private gatherings where wine flowed and conversations turned far from matters of state. In public, they condemned immorality among convicts. In private, they wrestled with their own forbidden longings. Colonial Australia was not merely a prison settlement, it was a society in flux. Soldiers, convicts, and settlers brought with them habits, vices, and desires. Governors were expected to rise above it, to embody English virtue in the wilderness. Yet temptation was everywhere. Thus, the colony became a stage where everyone played a role. Governors presented themselves as moral leaders, while carefully hiding the private theaters of their lives. One of the rare ways we glimpse these hidden desires is through letters and private correspondence. Some governors wrote back to England with carefully coded language. They might speak of comfort, companionship, or the challenges of loneliness. For the careful reader, these were not just political reports, but subtle admissions of the longings that haunted them. Some letters, preserved in archives, show an almost desperate yearning for intimacy. But these men knew that any open display of lust could destroy their reputations. So they concealed their desires in metaphors, in veiled expressions, in the silences between the lines. Why did governors hide their desires so carefully? The answer lies in the strict moral codes of the time. Victorian and Georgian values demanded restraint, especially from men in positions of power. Any scandal could undermine the fragile order of the colony. A governor exposed in a scandal would not only lose face, but also jeopardize the crown's authority in a distant land. So repression became second nature. governors smiled in public, gave speeches about morality, and punished convicts for indecency, all while quietly carrying the weight of their own hidden passions. Imagine the governor's house at night. The official visitors have gone. The candles are burning low. Perhaps a violin plays faintly in the background. The governor removes his ceremonial coat, loosens his collar, and the stern mask he wears in public begins to slip. In these private hours, some allowed themselves indulgences, whether it was fine wine, the company of a trusted confidant, or secret meetings hidden from the eyes of society. And yet, the masquerade had to continue. Servants were sworn to silence, guards turned a blind eye, and anyone who might talk learned quickly that discretion was their only protection. Secrecy was not just about protecting reputations, it was also a form of power. Governors understood that controlling their image was as important as controlling the colony itself. They built myths around themselves, myths of discipline, morality, and unshakable authority. Behind those myths, however, lay the same vulnerabilities as any other man: lust, longing, temptation. But unlike ordinary settlers, governors had the means to keep their secrets well hidden. Whispers traveled through the colony like smoke. Soldiers joked in barracks about the governor's private habits. Convicts speculated in hushed tones. Settlers passed rumors in taverns, their voices lowered. Everyone suspected, but no one dared to speak openly. Why? Because the colony's survival depended on the appearance of order. To admit that the governor himself indulged in hidden desires would be to admit that even the highest authority was fallible, and so silence became the rule. This silence carried a price. Governors lived under constant tension, the tension of presenting one face to the public while hiding another in private. Some bore this burden quietly, while others struggled. Letters and memoirs suggest that the loneliness of command in a distant land often intensified these desires. They were men torn between two worlds, the rigid expectations of empire and the raw, human impulses that empire could never erase. Ironically, some governors tried to channel their desires into strict public policies. They enforced harsh rules on relationships, morality, and sexuality in the colony. Perhaps in punishing others, they sought to suppress their own longings. It was a strange theater, governors condemning in public what they secretly experienced in private. And yet, no mask lasts forever. Over time, fragments of truth began to emerge. Letters discovered decades later, diary entries, offhand remarks, and journals all hinted at the hidden worlds of Australia's governors. While not every rumor can be proven, the pattern is clear. Men who wielded immense power also carried immense secrets. So as we look back at the polished portraits of Australia's first governors, we must ask ourselves, what did those stern faces conceal? Behind every proclamation of morality, behind every act of authority, there lurked desires that could never be spoken aloud. This is the untold story of men who ruled by day and hid their passions by night. But as we peel back the layers, we find that secrecy has its limits. The next chapter reveals how these hidden lusts shaped the colony itself. The story of Australia's early governors cannot be understood without stepping back into the political theater of the British Empire. These men were not ordinary administrators sent to a far-off land. They were figures with ambition, reputation, and reputations they desperately wanted to preserve. And yet, beneath their official duties, their personal weaknesses, especially their indulgences in lust and secret romances, were buried under carefully constructed facades. As ships arrived from Britain carrying convicts, soldiers, and supplies, the governor's residence in the colony of New South Wales became more than just a house of authority. It became the stage for whispered rumors, scandalous affairs, and cover-ups so thorough that they would remain hidden for decades. What seems at first like the rigid and disciplined life of an imperial officer quickly dissolves into a picture of human desire, uncontrollable, forbidden, but impossible to resist. Every governor who stepped onto Australian soil carried with him two identities. On the surface, he was the king's man, dressed in crisp uniforms, commanding authority, and ensuring discipline among both the convicts and free settlers. But behind closed doors, many led a second life. shaped by loneliness, temptation, and secrecy. In the early years, governors were often isolated, separated from their wives or noble circles back in England. Thousands of miles from home, surrounded by convicts and officers, opportunities for proper companionship were rare. That isolation created a dangerous freedom. In a colony where gossip spread like wildfire, but where evidence was easy to hide, governors could indulge their desires while presenting themselves as moral guardians in public. The contradiction was stark. These men spoke about honor, law, and morality in official speeches. Yet at night, inside candlelit chambers, they pursued passions that would have scandalized the empire had they been exposed. This double life became a pattern, repeated from one administration to the next, each governor inheriting not only the power of office, but also the temptations of secrecy. Among the convict women, stories began to circulate. Some spoke of receiving favors, lighter punishments, or sudden privileges after catching the eye of influential figures. Though never recorded officially, these rumors reflected a reality. Women who were otherwise powerless sometimes found themselves entangled in relationships with men of authority. The governors, keen to keep such liaisons away from official records, relied on layers of secrecy. Servants were bribed, guards were ordered to remain silent, and letters were destroyed. What remained were only fragments, hints in private correspondence, suspicious promotions, or unexplained transfers of individuals who knew too much. One example, often whispered about, was the governor's frequent hosting of private gatherings. Officially, these were described as dinners or meetings. In reality, they often transformed into late-night entertainments where alcohol flowed, music played, and the boundaries between official duty and personal desire blurred. Those invited knew better than to speak openly, for fear of retaliation. What makes these hidden affairs remarkable is not merely that they happened, but how effectively they were concealed. Unlike in London, where gossip columns and social scandals could destroy a man's career overnight, Australia's remoteness worked in the governor's favor. Scandals could be contained within the colony, delayed from reaching England for months or even years due to the slow pace of ships carrying reports back across the oceans. The governors learned to use this distance as a shield. By the time word reached England, details had blurred, evidence was scarce, and official explanations had already been crafted. Reports were polished to remove any trace of indiscretion. Meanwhile, individuals who posed a threat, those who had seen too much or spoken too openly, were quietly reassigned, imprisoned, or pressured into silence. In many ways, this concealment became an art form. The governors were not simply hiding affairs, they were creating illusions. They projected images of discipline and piety while orchestrating private lives filled with indulgence. To the public eye, they were moral leaders. To those behind the curtains, they were men of flesh and desire. The obsession with secrecy stemmed from more than personal fear. In the 18th and 19th centuries, reputation was everything. A scandal could end a career, strip away honors, and leave a man disgraced not only in the colony, but in the aristocratic circles of England. The pressure to appear honorable drove governors to extraordinary lengths to protect their names. Even when suspicions arose, the colonial administration rallied to suppress them. Officers who questioned the governor's conduct were often accused of disloyalty. Newspapers, which occasionally hinted at improprieties, were censored or shut down. Silence was enforced not only by the governor himself, but by the machinery of colonial power. This climate of fear and loyalty ensured that the public image remained intact. To the settlers, the governor remained a stern, commanding figure. But in the shadows, stories grew, passed from one generation to the next, whispered in taverns, and remembered by those who had seen the truth. What these hidden desires reveal is the human vulnerability beneath the grandeur of authority. These governors were men torn between duty and passion. They upheld laws against immorality while secretly breaking those very rules. They punished convicts for acts of lust and disobedience, even as they indulged in their own forbidden affairs. In this contradiction lies the heart of the story. Power and desire are inseparable. The very authority that gave governors control over lives and destinies also gave them opportunities to exploit that power for personal satisfaction. The isolation of the colony magnified this tendency. With little oversight and vast distances separating them from the empire, they operated in a space where accountability was easily blurred. And yet, despite all the secrecy, cracks appeared. Some scandals eventually leaked, some letters survived, and some witnesses spoke out. The result is a picture of governance not as a flawless institution of imperial order, but as a deeply human stage where weakness, temptation, and the hunger for pleasure shaped decisions as much as duty and law. The question remains, if these governors were so careful, how do we know about their hidden desires at all? The answer lies in the fragments, documents, testimonies, and controversies that slipped through the cracks of censorship. In the next part of the story, we will step deeper into those cracks, uncovering the specific tales, betrayals, and scandals that reveal how even the most powerful men in Australia could not keep their lustful secrets buried forever. When we left off, the governor's desires were no longer just whispered behind lace curtains or scribbled in coded diaries. They were woven into the very fabric of colonial Australia's social and political life. Yet the most astonishing part of this saga isn't merely the hidden affairs themselves, it's how skillfully those men managed to disguise them beneath the cloak of authority, propriety, and carefully staged morality. The final act of this story is one of duplicity perfected, where governors became masters of illusion, ensuring their lusts remained invisible to all but the most trusted insiders. To truly grasp how these men shielded their private sins, we need to step into the paradox of their existence. They were at once the most visible figures in the colony and the most secretive. They dined at grand tables under candle-lit chandeliers, where every gesture was noted by ambitious rivals. They were trailed by servants, aides, and clerks. And yet, behind closed doors, they conducted an entirely different life. That double existence required relentless control over perception, over narrative, and over the people who might expose them. One cannot underestimate the power of appearances in early Australia. Governors wore their uniforms not just as garments, but as armor. The gold braids, ceremonial swords, and immaculate coats sent a clear message: I am untouchable. This outward show of discipline provided perfect camouflage. After all, how could a man so steeped in dignity possibly be guilty of indulging in desires that were considered shameful? Balls and receptions offered the stage. Guests witnessed the governor dancing with elegance, offering polite conversation, and playing the role of refined gentleman. But those same gatherings also provided opportunity, the chance to lock eyes with a young woman across the floor, to exchange coded compliments, to slip into the garden where shadows concealed whispered promises. The very events meant to reinforce authority became gateways to transgression. A governor's lust could not remain hidden without allies. Servants, aides, and officers often played the role of silent protectors. Consider the footman who knocked gently before entering a room, buying his master precious seconds to cover up, or the aide-de-camp who intentionally diverted attention when a woman slipped from the hall at the same time as his superior. These men knew the risks, but also the rewards. Loyalty was purchased with favors, promotions, gifts, or simply the security of being in the governor's trusted circle. Secrecy became a form of currency. To be included in the inner ring meant you were protected by the governor's power, but it also meant you carried the weight of his hidden sins. Betrayal would not only bring ruin upon the governor, but also upon yourself. Thus, silence was ensured not by morality, but by mutual dependence. The governors also mastered a language of disguise, carefully chosen words that could mean one thing publicly and another privately. Letters, for instance, were filled with euphemisms. A governor might write to a confidant, "I find her company most refreshing after the burdens of office." To the untrained eye, such a statement appeared harmless. To those who knew, it carried layers of suggestion. Even journals, the supposed raw confessions of a man's life, were written with a veil. Instead of admitting passion directly, a governor might record, "The evening was most agreeable, though the air rather heavy." Behind those vague lines, entire worlds of secret encounters were hidden. It is little wonder that historians have spent decades trying to decode these cryptic passages. No account of this story would be complete without acknowledging the wives. Some were entirely oblivious. Others, however, understood more than they ever admitted. A governor's wife lived in the constant glare of public scrutiny. Her role was to embody virtue, to set the standard for colonial women. Yet she too could become a participant in the act of concealment. There were cases where a wife, sensing the gossip swirling around her husband, chose silence. Speaking out could destroy not just the marriage, but the family's entire social standing. Others adopted a subtler strategy, redirecting attention with their own charm, ensuring the household remained the picture of harmony, even as private betrayals brewed behind closed doors. In a sense, these women became co-conspirators in protecting the facade. Religion also played its part. Public displays of faith, attending church, funding chapels, quoting scripture, created a moral shield. Colonists saw governors kneeling in prayer and assumed righteousness. Few dared imagine that the same man might leave service only to slip into another life of secret desires. The contradiction was staggering, yet it worked precisely because people wanted to believe in the governor's piety. Another critical piece of the disguise lay in suppressing dissent. When whispers grew too loud, governors acted decisively. Servants who hinted at scandal were dismissed under vague accusations of impropriety or disloyalty. Clerks who stumbled upon compromising letters found themselves reassigned to distant posts. Newspapers, when they dared to speculate, were reminded of the harsh consequences of challenging authority. The colonial press, still fragile in its early years, rarely had the strength to stand against the governor's power. Thus, even rumors of misconduct were quickly silenced. What remained in circulation were half-truths and suggestive anecdotes, just enough to fuel gossip, but never enough to topple a man's career. For ordinary colonists, this created a strange duality. On one hand, they were subject to harsh rules about morality and discipline. On the other, they saw, though only in whispers, that those same rules did not apply to the most powerful. This disconnect fueled cynicism, a sense that justice was selective, and that survival in the colony required its own kind of performance. Centuries later, the paper trail still carries faint echoes of those hidden lives. Diaries, letters, and secondhand accounts offer tantalizing glimpses, but rarely the full truth. Historians can piece together patterns, sudden disappearances, unexplained gifts, cryptic notes, but the governor's skill at concealment means the complete story may never be known. What remains is the understanding that history is not simply about battles and laws. It is also about the quiet dramas behind closed doors, the secret desires that shaped decisions, and the masks leaders wore to protect themselves. In the end, the story of Australian governors hiding their lustful desires is not merely one of scandal, it is one of human nature. Men entrusted with absolute authority discovered that power could not erase longing. Instead, it gave them the tools to pursue it, while ensuring no one could hold them accountable. They built walls of appearances, alliances, and fear. They turned wives, aides, and servants into accomplices. They cloaked themselves in religion, punished dissent, and wrote their own narratives. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy that reminds us of the fragile line between public virtue and private vice. The colony grew, the governors changed, and the centuries passed. Yet their story lingers, an unsettling reminder that history's grand figures were not immune to secret desires, and that sometimes the most powerful legacies are not the ones written in laws or monuments, but in the whispers that still echo through time.